Let's just let the numbers rise a little bit before we begin. Okay, let's make a start. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the first in our series of webinars. My name is Melissa. I'm the Marketing Communications Manager at Urban Fox, and I'll be moderating the webinar. Today, we'll be discussing the future of EV charging networks and the impact of the 2035 delay on our journey towards sustainable and cleaner mobility. With the recent government announcement delaying the ban on the sale of new ICE vehicles until 2035, it's crucial for us to understand the implications for the deployment of EV charging infrastructure. As well as exploring the theme, this webinar also serves as a forum to discuss new ideas and de-risking strategies for optimizing the deployment of a sustainable EV charging networks. Good morning, everyone. Morning, thanks for joining us. We're very lucky to have a distinguished panel of experts to shed light on this important subject. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists who will provide valuable insights from various angles. Offering the government's perspective, we have Aaron Berry from OZEV, the Office for Zero Emission Vehicles. Next, we have Vicky Reid representing ChargeUK and giving the charging industry perspective. Vicky is also the Head of Policy and Public Affairs at Connected Curb, so a fellow ChargePoint operator too. Next, we have Yon Apahumi, who is the Managing Director of UK Investments at Balfour Beatty Investments, and will be offering the investor's perspective. And last but not least, we have Ollie Freeling-Wilkinson, the CEO of Urban Fox Networks, who will be giving us the ChargePoint operator's perspective today. So here's how the webinar will go, hopefully. Each panelist will give a short 5-minute presentation. This will be followed by a moderated discussion and questions. And lastly, we'll open the floor to questions from our audience. I encourage all attendees to actively participate by submitting your questions. You can do this using the Q&A feature on your screen. And make sure you state who on the panel the question is for. We'll do our very best to address as many questions as possible during our Q&A session at the end. And any questions we don't get to, we'll try and get them answered for you after the webinar. So let's begin with our first panelist. Aaron, welcome.
Good morning, Melissa, and good morning, everyone. Yes, not often I get called distinguished, but thank you for that. On this very wet morning across everywhere, I think. So yes, my name's Aaron Berry. I'm one of the deputy heads for the Office for Zero Emission Vehicles. I'm responsible in particular for local charging infrastructure, but I'll give you a bit of an overview on the position overall within OZEV and government at the moment on EV charging infrastructure in particular. So next slide, please. So I was asked to give a bit of an update on what the sort of net zero changes to the government policy meant in this space. And I think that the big message is not a great deal actually for EV charging infrastructure, and the announcement and confirmation of the ZEV mandate and the uptake of electric vehicles that will be required through regulation from next year. Up until 2030, it is as it was before the net zero changes. So you can see in the graph, the brightly coloured graph in the bottom right-hand corner there, the uptake of electric vehicles over the course of the next 7 years to 2030 and the 5 years beyond that. Very, very sharp uptake. There are something like 1 million vehicles with a plug today. It could be 6 to 10 million in just the course of the next 7 years or so. The change to the policy becomes between 2030 and 2035. So up to 2030, 80% of new vehicles, or in 2030, 80% of new vehicles will be required to be zero emission, which will largely be electric in the sort of cars and vans segment. The change to the policy is illustrated by the purple wedge in the top right-hand corner. So previously that would have had to have been hybrid vehicles with which were yet to be defined precisely by the regulations. Now it will be open to more regular petrol and diesel cars and vans as well. So that was the change. It is relatively minor, and it won't make much difference, if any, in the period to 2030. So loads more electric vehicles coming shortly, I think, is the key message. Alongside that, the government announced the government's plan for drivers, which contained a number of measures that should support the provision of and the acceleration of EV charging infrastructure as well. I won't read all those points on the left-hand side of the page in my couple of minutes, but you can see those for yourselves. But all of which are designed to help with the provision and the speedy provision of charging infrastructure. Next slide, please, Melissa. So on local EV charging infrastructure, so this is the area that I'm responsible for in particular, we have a major fund, a £450 million fund that is supporting local charging provision. It's comprised of nearly 400 million of capital funding and a further close to 50 million of resource funding for local authorities. They can hire EV officers and put those in place. That funding is already in train, and many EV officers has already been hired in local authorities on the back of this funding. So the timetable is quite tight, and it's really is there to support that local provision. And we have something like 50,000 charge points across the network today. Totally, we'll be looking like something like 300,000 again in the course of the next 7 years or so. So a huge ramp up in charging infrastructure. Not all of that is going to be in the local space, but an awful lot of it will do, and it needs to, and that is very much with the support of local authorities in making sure that they have charging provision for residents, particularly those without access to off-street parking. We know most people with electric vehicles today are those with driveways. My phone is going nuts here. So next slide, please. But as well as the sort of local charging support, we also have support for work and residential grants. That these have morphed quite a bit over the course of the last year or so. So previously we had support for people with driveways, and that has really kicked off that sector of the market, and it's now if you have a driveway and you have an EV, you'll almost certainly put a charge point in, and they are not overly costly these days. But there are challenges for others, people in flats and people renting. There are challenges for landlords and ongoing challenges for workplaces. And therefore, we have a range of grants available, including for infrastructure in certain areas. So think about sort of blocks of flats where you have allocated parking. That's another area where sort of growing segment of the market in terms of people requiring or in terms of where people are living these days. So really important that we get charge points across those areas as well. And there is support in that area now. So we're very keen for these grants to be taken up. They won't be there forever. I think generally speaking, grants in the space of infrastructure won't be there forever. There's a great deal more certainty now that the OZEV mandate is coming. So this is perhaps the last major slug of investment coming from the government. What we really want to see is a ready commercial market, and that's one of the main drivers or main objectives of the Levi Fund as well, to really move the market on so it can stand on its own 2 feet. And I think that's it for me, Melissa. Have I got sort of one? Yeah, there's a sort of question slide at the end, but I think we're taking the questions afterwards.
Yes, thanks, Aaron. Yeah, we'll take the questions afterwards. As I said before, if anyone has any questions, you can ask them in the Q&A section on your screen. Next, we have Vicky from ChargeUK.
Thanks, Melissa. Morning, everyone. Really impressive number of people you've managed to get here at Balfour, so well done, and thanks for having us. As Melissa said right at the outset, I'm here today representing ChargeUK. where I'm vice chair and I chair our policy and communications committee. But the day job is at Connected Curb, another on-street provider. So I thought I should just flag that, as that's the paid job. So just moving on to the next slide, if you can. So who's ChargeUK? So we were launched just 6 months ago in April this year to provide a voice for the growing EV charging sector. And here we launched with 18 CPOs in April. We're now up to about 24, and we're looking to attract some more members into next year, and I've got a nice list of people wanting to join. So what's interesting, I think very valuable about this list we've got here is the breadth and the composition. So we have what's interesting, we've got the international CPOs, so we have Fastned, Mer, Ionity, who are very dominant across the EU and also in the UK. We have the large, I guess, energy companies. We've got Shell, Total, BP, ESB, who are obviously now turning their hand to this market in particular. And we've got the growing number of sort of homegrown scale-ups, such as Connected Curb, Urban Fox, Osprey, GridServe. So we've got the real breadth of representation here. At the moment, we're predominantly looking at public charging, but across that breadth, we've also, we've got on-street, destination, and rapid. So we've got the full range covered. If you could move on to the next slide. So in the kind of 4 minutes I've got left, I'm just going to try and answer the big question. So how do we de-risk on the road ahead? So let's just start with where are we now? I think Aaron's teed this up very nicely, which is we know the sort of exam question here is how to decarbonise our transport as quickly as possible, and that moving over to EVs is a big part of that. The government set out really clearly in the strategy last year that they want this to be a private investment-led rollout, with public sector supporting where required. And as Aaron said, there's a LEFI fund out there. RCF is there as well. Crucial role for local authorities, and also the government obviously providing lots of other policies and support to help that private investment to flow and get those charge points into the ground. And I think where we are now, the private sector is responding very, very well. We've seen a 43% year-on-year growth from this September to last, so we're going very quickly upwards. We hit the magic number of 50,000 public charge points last month, which is a really important milestone. And I think when we launched in April this year, ChargeUK said that together combined, our members had committed already 6 billion in investment through to 2030. So that number's pretty risen now. Actually, we have more members. So it's a very, very large number that we are committing to spend on building this infrastructure out. Next slide, please. But as we know that we're not there yet. So where on this road are we heading? We all know we need to accelerate that growth. It's been encouraging in the last year or so, but we need to go even quicker. And we're of the view we just need more types of all charging, the right numbers of chargers in the right place. As a sector, we get a little bit nervous about numbers. There's various numbers out there about how many we need. I think in truth, we don't exactly know. So I think we just need to, as CPOs working with local authorities and others, work out where the need is and try and get our infrastructure in there just ahead of demand. So how are we going to get to where we're going to get to? As two things I'm going to highlight just now. I think we need to de-risk that private investment. We've got 6 billion waiting in the wings. How do we get that flowing as quickly as possible, and even more if possible? So we need to create the right conditions to enable that investment to flow. And then we need to de-risk delivery. So we need to go at pace. So I'm just going to focus on those two things in the time I have left. If you could move to the next slide, please. So as I said, we've got a lot of investment wanting to be spent, and a lot of that investment was raised on the basis of a couple of years ago, that the big announcement around the original 2030 date, where petrol and diesel cars would be phased out, and the ZEV mandate, which, as Aaron has just said, was all about EV sales. So the two things working in parallel. And I think the reason that was important is when we're trying to invest infrastructure ahead of demand, which, as we know, especially for people who don't have the ability to charge at home, knowing where you can charge is a really important decision before you go ahead and get an EV. So we know, and I think the policymakers are encouraging us to get investment out there ahead of demand. But if you're investing significantly ahead of demand, you need something to place that bet against. And that bet came in the form of the 2030 date and the ZEV mandate. And that's why earlier this year, when there were some discussions about whether that date would change, ChargeUK put out an open letter urging the Prime Minister to stand firm to support that investment. So it was a little bit disappointing around the change to 2035. But I think the main message here is, I think, the one which Aaron has already delivered, which is because the ZEV mandate remains incredibly ambitious, actually momentum remains, and it's very much business as usual. We know there are going to be a very significant number of EVs on the road over the coming decade, and that this transition is going to take place, and we need to get that infrastructure in the ground ahead of that. So I think that the positive message remains. We would, though, I think Aaron's been very positive in his messaging today, but I think there needs to be, to support that momentum, discussion across all stakeholders, government included, about where we're going, and it's a positive move. Obviously, it's good for the environment. It's also good economic sense. You could move on, please. So the second part is we've got the investment flowing, but we need to get that investment into the ground as quickly and efficiently as possible. And that means de-risking the delivery. I think it's important, if we're going to hit the numbers we need to hit, whether it's 300,000 or a different number, we need to move very quickly from a kind of cottage industry to a massive scale industry. We need to get these machines working really, really efficiently, and to speed up what we're doing. Now, ChargeUK has been working over the last few months to spend time with our members, really to understand what is slowing us down. We're all working incredibly hard, and I spend all week, every week, with our members, and I know they're all working incredibly hard to increase the pace of rollout. But what's stopping us from going quicker? And I think you probably won't be surprised to hear where the hotspots or the obstacles are. They're in, how quickly we can secure grid connections, particularly on the kind of high-speed end of things. We need to speed up how we secure planning permits, how we consult residents, and we also need to get that public funding and procurement going as quickly as possible to match the pace of the private investment. So I won't spoil our big report by telling you what all of our proposals are now, but do watch this space, and we'll be coming out with some very firm suggestions in the coming weeks and months to help us move those things forward. But I think the most important thing, and again, it won't come as a surprise, is CPOs don't work in a vacuum. We can't do this by ourselves. We have to work with partners to get this happening. So we have to work with our DNOs, the local authorities, our highways authorities. We have to work with funders. We have to work with government. So a lot of what we're trying to do here is to make that partner collaboration work much better, by understanding each other, by understanding each other's needs, and where possible, standardising and streamlining all those processes which just need to happen multiple times every single day to get the infrastructure in the ground that we need. So I'll stop there, and I'm sure we'll have some questions later, but hopefully that sets the scene about how we think we're going to get where we need to get to.
Thanks so much, Vicky. Our next panelist is Jon from Balfour Beatty Investments. Jon, you're on mute.
I hope everybody can see myself. Good morning, everybody. So a little bit of background. As Melissa said, I'm the Managing Director of Balfour Beatty Investments in the UK. A little bit of background about Balfour Beatty to start with. I'm sure many local authorities are familiar with the fact that we are part of the Balfour Beatty PLC group, which is a FTSE 250 listed company. We are, importantly and of relevance to today's discussion, one of the founder partners and the sole funder to Urban Fox, owning 81% of that partnership. We have been an investor in essential infrastructure, public infrastructure now for 28 years, so we've been around for a long time. Our portfolio comprises today some 26 investments with a value of £578 million. And we have, importantly again, I think very relevant to EV charging infrastructure, a successful track record of working in partnership with the public sector to design, build, finance, operate infrastructure, critically over the long term. And often that involves contracts, concession-based contracts that are typically 25 years or longer in duration, all of which are with public sector bodies. We aim to be a trusted partner who provides consistently high service on a long-term basis to our partners and ultimately to those who are using the infrastructure. And the energy transition is now a key part of our investment strategy at Balfour Beatty Investments, and indeed is a fundamental part of the wider strategy within the Balfour Beatty Group. So ultimately what we bring to Urban Fox and hopefully to the charge point industry is Balfour Beatty's market presence, our reputation, capability, financial strength, and indeed our long-term outlook. So I wanted to just cover the investor's perspective on what will help us to invest in EV charge points. So firstly, a well-functioning and sustainable market. And a key pillar of that, coming back to Aaron's discussion, is government policy that is clear and consistent. That obviously is vital in providing certainty and confidence for investors to commit resource to fund infrastructure and indeed the infrastructure needed for the EV transition. Whilst the 29 deadline for ICE vehicles does provide clarity and certainty for those of us investing in the market, and I agree with Aaron, probably the recent change doesn't have that material an effect. I would say to government that changing policy or making tweaks to policy does create uncertainty and perhaps doubt, and that's never good from an investor perspective. So please stick with the policy. We're investing at the front end. We are making that commitment now. Grant funding is welcomed, and I think it's an area where government has helped to kickstart the market by supporting local authorities and CPOs, and from an investor perspective by reducing some of the more challenging risks. It is, however, I think important that grant funding is applied in the right way and for the right reasons, and I'll pick up on this shortly. So what else do we want for a well-functioning and sustainable market? A pipeline of tenders that come to market at a sustainable pace. CPOs and their investors have all spent a great deal of time and money to create their businesses. For this to be worthwhile, we need a pipeline of opportunities to come to the market over a period of time such that we have a reasonable prospect. Remember, we are in competition and we relish that competition, but we have a reasonable prospect of winning a meaningful number. It's important that those tenders come to market at a sensible pace. If it's too slow, then clearly deployment of charge points will not keep pace with the demand from the transition to EVs, and CPOs will struggle to sustain their businesses. Conversely, if too many tenders come to market at the same time, local authorities will effectively be competing with one another. CPOs will be unable to cope and will need to be selective. Ultimately, this will be reflected in the number and the quality of tender returns received by local authorities. So I think a key point of this for us is that we think OZEV probably has an important role to play in actively managing the market, and that is in the interests of all market participants, both private and public sector. So tenders need to be of sufficient scale. That's a really important point to us as an investor. Clearly, the costs of running and responding to a procurement are mainly fixed for both local authorities and indeed for participants. It makes sense, therefore, for those tenders to be large enough to maximise the benefit involved in spending that money. Put another way, a tender for just 50 sockets offers a much lower investment and return opportunity than one for 500. And it almost certainly means that a local authority will have to run subsequent or multiple tenders, thereby increasing the time, cost and effort for all parties and also delaying charge point installation. As I mentioned earlier, grant funding is important, but it needs to be used judiciously. So where AUKS or levy funding is part of a tender, we would ask OZEV and local authorities to maximise the opportunity for private investment. to make every effort to ensure that taxpayers' money is only used where private finance isn't really viable, either because utilization of a particular charger on a particular site is expected to be low, or because the grid connection cost is very, very high. I would reassure all the local authorities joining us today that there is no shortage of investment capital to support the development of a robust, competitive and high-performing charge point industry. However, if CPOs have to compete with grant funding, that will only weaken and slow down the development of the CPO market. So we counsel local authorities to consider these points when deciding on the parameters of their tenders, so they can maximise private investment and charge point deployment. I should mention that we need to have sensible and realistic procurement timeframes. Bid timetables need to be long enough such that bidders have the opportunity to fully consider the requirements of the local authorities and to develop their proposals. We think that for a financed network, and I'm talking about a fully funded solution here for on-street charge points under a concession-based agreement, that period should be no less than 12 weeks. We do think that if there are shorter periods being used, that will ultimately mean that the quality of the bids received by local authorities will be limited, and ultimately that will mean that more work will have to be done subsequent to appointment of preferred bidder. So I think please give us enough time and you'll get the maximum benefit out of that process. And ultimately, I think that will actually speed up deployment, perhaps rather than slowing it down. So what else will help us invest in EV charge points? And this comes on to a really important point, I think, from our perspective, which is around standardization. I think, Vicky, you mentioned standardization earlier on. So standard commercial terms that are balanced, proportionate, and meet the needs of local authorities, residents, and charge point operators. So we advocate an industry-wide standard comprising 2 interlinked agreements. And we feel strongly that creating an industry standard contractual arrangements is a vital part of creating an effective, efficient and competitive long-term CPO market. And again, I'm talking here about the fully funded model where the private sector provides a significant proportion of the financing that is operated under a long-term concession contract. I think OZEV's heads of terms, Aaron, are a very helpful start, but currently these leave a lot of work to be done by each local authority to turn those heads of terms into a contract that can be signed at the end of their tender process. I think that probably puts a heavy burden on local authorities who may not have the resource, the time or the know-how to develop such an agreement. So as an alternative, we propose that OZEV, together with representatives from the marketplace, produce standard agreements that can then be used in bids across the entire industry. The benefit of this is clearly that there's a single process for formulating and negotiating a contract, rather than having multiple processes across different local authority bids, resulting in a diverse range of potential commercial outcomes. Once we have standardization, all CPOs and all local authorities will know what is being bid to them, what obligations they have, what services they can expect to receive. And I think that's key in order that we have transparency and understanding and that pricing is appropriate. Ultimately, this approach should reduce procurement costs for all parties and should reduce the time needed to sign a contract once a preferred bidder has been selected, and therefore it should improve ultimately the deployment timeframes for deploying EV charging infrastructure. Arrangements that are flexible and foster partnership and collaboration. I'm not going to say a great deal about this point, but our experience over the last 28 years is that flexibility and collaboration are essential ingredients of a strong and enduring partnering relationship between a local authority and a CPO. A key part of standard agreements is to have what we consider a partnering agreement to initially plan and install the network. This will initially deal with the backlog of charge point installations that will need to be addressed, and hopefully that will stimulate further local EV adoption. But installations, of course, will go on for a much longer period of time. But exactly how long and how quickly EV charging points will need to be installed will depend on the pace of EV adoption. If adoption happens faster, then any installation plan agreed at the outset will need to be accelerated, and our partnering agreement approach would allow that to happen. If adoption is much slower, it may be appropriate to slow down for a while. From an investor perspective, we want to meet the growing needs of residents and stimulate the EV transition, but we also want to avoid a situation where we invest in installing chargers that aren't yet needed and earn little or no revenue for a long period of time. So it's about finding a balance, striking the right balance. Alongside the partnering agreement to deal with planning the network and installing it, we would propose a long-term concession agreement to operate and maintain the chargers. This brings the benefit of being able to spread recovery of the upfront capital costs over a longer period, thereby reducing tariffs. It's also fundamentally important to CPOs in allowing them to manage utilization risk, i.e. The uncertainty in the pace of adoption and the growth of charging revenues. Payback of our upfront investment will take time, and the period of that is uncertain and depends on the rate at which utilization grows, and that's why we're advocating longer concession agreements. What goes hand in hand with that, of course, and I think many local authorities will probably have this concern, is they need there to be sufficiently stringent performance KPIs. We would advocate having those standardized across the industry, but those should incorporate an opportunity for CPOs to rectify deteriorating performance, but ultimately they must allow local authorities to terminate a poorly performing CPO. I think we will stand by our performance, and we've done that for the last 28 years. And then briefly, what I would say, all of these contracts, technology is going to change. Users' needs are going to change. So a robust concession agreement must have a good change protocol, which deals with how the parties will actually adopt change and agree change between themselves. And then a couple of final points. Appropriate limits on contractual liability, where there is contractual liability for a CPO, it is sensible to cap that in a balanced and proportionate way. And then perhaps the last point that I would talk about is clarity on what happens at the end of a contract or when a contract is terminated. And the one we see the most in procurement is that often local authorities want the ultimate flexibility to terminate a contract without cause. And I think in that situation, there needs to be appropriate compensation payable to a CPO who's performing perfectly well at that point in time, acknowledging again the upfront investment that they have made in installing the charge points. So then in summary, I'd say we're keen to support the decarbonisation of transport in the UK, and we see the installation of on-street EV charge points as a key part of that, and clearly very vital to those 10 million households that have to park their cars on street. We believe we can help to create a sustainable, competitive and efficient market to support LAs in delivering charge points, and we will draw our extensive experience in long-term infrastructure to influence and shape the industry. We see ultimately an attractive long-term investment opportunity if the right market dynamics and contractual arrangements in place. Thank you.
Thanks, Jan. Our final panelist is Ollie from Urban Fox.
Hey everybody, thanks for having me today here today. I'm Ollie, CEO from Urban Fox, a brand new charge point operator in the UK, backed by Balfour Beatty Investments. But as much as I'd like to, I'm not here to sell you Urban Fox, but to talk about how we can all work collaboratively, that's CPOs and local authorities, to develop a sustainable charging network to help us achieve the best outcomes within our control possible. And apologies if I echo some of the points already made today, but I guess it kind of shows some broad consensus on some of the issues. And so to start, whilst I think we can all appreciate that every local authority and CPO will be different and will all have slightly different agendas or issues to solve, particularly on a local level, I think it's worth setting out what we believe are broadly common objectives or positive outcomes when it comes to building a charging network. I mean, the first I believe we'd all like to see is a step up in the pace of current charge point deployment to ensure we can at the very least catch up with and get ahead of existing demand. The second is that the charging network we develop together is sustainable. So this would include being able to ensure the long-term growth of the network by leveraging as much private sector investment as possible, which will ultimately save local authorities time and resources. Creating steady local employment opportunities, and importantly, bringing the communities we serve along with us as we grow the network. And finally, I think we'd all like to see the price gap between the haves, i.e. those who have a drive or garage and can charge conveniently at home, often quite cheaply, and the have-nots, those who don't have access to a drive or garage and have to predominantly rely on public charging, to close. And so there are clearly factors outside of our control, the difference in VAT, for example, between private and public charging. But if we adopt a collaborative partnership approach, whilst using the learnings from infrastructure projects in other sectors, the good and particularly the bad, we can together make considerable headway to meeting our common objectives. So what does this mean? It boils down to long-term contracts and a more flexible deployment strategy, which will essentially help us achieve our objectives. Long-term contracts, I think Jon mentioned, who ideally the longer the better, to at least 15 years. And this is really important because it means we can leverage way more private investment than would otherwise be the case, whilst utilising grants where available to sustainably grow the charging network to 100% EV. It also means the tariff consumers pay can be lower. If we think of it in the same way as a mortgage, as we know, the shorter the term of a mortgage, the higher the repayments. And it's no different for CPOs or investors when it comes to funding, building and maintaining a charging network. The shorter the contract, the higher the tariff will need to be to recoup that investment, and vice versa. But a long-term contract shouldn't scare a local authority. There should be a really clear path to terminate an agreement if the CPO doesn't deliver on its obligations. So there should always be a get out of jail card. And so keeping in mind that we can't take anything for granted, the 2035 announcement's a good example. There is uncertainty around utilisation and how it will grow over time. And the chances are that what we think we know about charge point deployment today is very likely to change with new information over time. So once we have met existing demand, we should consider adopting a more flexible or strategic approach to charge point deployment. And why is this important? By being more strategic, which in practice would essentially mean reviewing and adapting the network plan to ensure it's always relevant, to ensure that we're always installing the right charge points in the right place at the right time. This very de-risking of charge point deployment will make it more sustainable and actually allow us to maximize private investment. This approach will also create a steady stream of local employment as we grow and maintain the network. And finally, and importantly, it means we can bring the communities along with us by ensuring we get the pace of charge point deployment just right. And so in order to help us achieve our common objectives, whilst being able to access as much private investment as possible, we're suggesting a tweak to the existing concession model to essentially split charge point deployment into two contracts. So the first contract is a collaborative partnering agreement that covers all the network planning and design activities. This could take the form of a 15-year agreement to get us 100% EV, for example, but broken down into 5-year manageable batches. So from a high level, the objectives for the first 5-year plan could be to install 1,000 charge points, which would roughly equate to 16 or 17 charge points installed every month over that 5-year period. However, as we go along, it may be decided, that the 1,000 charge points is too much or not enough. And so we adjust the plan to ensure the outcomes are still positive and we're deploying just ahead of demand. The second contract would be more your typical concession agreement to cover the installation and services delivery for charge points installed in each 5-year plan. So in practice, you have your 5-year core investment period aligned with a network plan, and then a 15-year concession. And so each concession would include a KPI framework and sensible and relevant service level expectations. I've kind of given you a very high level overview today, to keep us on time, but we do have more detailed draft heads of terms that we're very, very happy to share with any of you that are interested. So please do contact us. But I will end the presentation there, but thank you for taking the time to listen.
Thanks so much, Ollie. We've got a few pre-submitted questions. I'm going to just run through those really quickly because we've only got about 15 minutes. So first question is for Aaron. Within the Levi bids, is OZEV looking for projects which mainly focus on the delivery of public on-street EV infrastructure rather than private on-street EV infrastructure?
But yes, primarily yes, but there is flexibility, and I think one of the challenges, just to come back to Ian's point around sort of standardized contracts, while we're very much headed in that direction, I think one of the challenges is that charge points are not quite widgets yet. There are a range of solutions, from rapid charging to on street to gullies, the sort of the channels in the pavement, lots of different solutions, and it's for local authorities to sort of work out what is most appropriate for their individual circumstances. That said, there are some sort of red lines around the Levi funding, one of which is that the majority of the funding should be towards lower powered local charging, so primarily on street.
Thank you. The next question is for Ollie. What are the main challenges to an equitable rollout of charging across all types of residential development, traditional and new?
All right, yeah. I think from our perspective, it probably boils down to the cost of deployment today. I mean, there are huge differences in installation costs from one street or a postcode to another. A big unknown could be the grid connection cost, for example, how much, how far it is from a desired location to put charge points. You often find that you'll find an optimal location for a number of reasons, but it may prove commercially unviable due to the grid connection costs, for example, or the fact you have to cross a road. So for me, I think that's one of the big challenges. So I would probably urge those with the Levi funding to use it where the private sector can't, in order to not crowd out the private sector investment in areas that it can invest in.
Thank you, Ollie. Next question is for Vicky. Practitioners in the delivery professions are often challenged by the assertion that the network won't support full-scale take-up of EVs, so interest will fizzle out at some point. Is this true, and what is your view?
Thanks for the question. I think we've all four of us who spoke, I think, have spoken very unanimously about the fact that we know this transition is taking place. The policy's there to support that in terms of the EV sales, and we're also, all of us here, working now on getting that infrastructure there just ahead of that trajectory. So I think I'm 100% confident this is not going to fizzle out. This is going to happen. I think the pace at which it happens is still a bit to be determined, and I think I think as a group we're very, very keen to see that trajectory of deployment go up even quicker. What exact shape that trajectory takes over the next 15 years, I'm not entirely sure. But I think the investment's there, the policies are there, the market is growing. From almost nothing 10 years ago, we've got a huge UK sector now ready to deploy. And as we've also, I think we're all this ready to work with partners to make this happen. So I'm pretty confident this is not going to fizzle out.
Thank you. The next question is for Ollie again. It's a very long question, so bear with me. One of the biggest challenges about public on-street charging is the cost in comparison to private charging. Not only is there an aspect of social justice in respect of levelling up access to EVs for people who do not have access to off-street parking, who are also typically on lower incomes than those that do, but even if we were to provide adequate public on-street EV infrastructure, residents would still be at the mercy of public prices. What are CPOs willing to accept in terms of price capping? Appreciating the fact that Urban Fox cannot speak on behalf of other operators, will this affect the level of private investment or contract lengths or revenue share?
Wow, that's a big question. Yeah. And actually, it's a topic, no doubt, you know, us as Urban Fox and no doubt Vicky and everyone else who's a CPO kind of constantly wrestles with. You know, but speaking from Urban Fox's perspective, I think, you know, we are very open to finding ways that not only encourage private investment, but also gives the residents who rely on public networks the best deal possible. You know, keep in mind that as a CPO, investing huge amount of money, you know, we're as motivated as anyone to ensure the pricing is fair and encourages utilization, or we lose money, which isn't a great outcome for a business. So you know, on a positive note, I do believe the price gap will significantly close as the networks mature and we get close to 100% EVs. And it kind of starts, I think, with price transparency or the tariff transparency. You know, it shouldn't be a black box. You know, there are the components that make up the tariff should be open and out there. So, you know, you have the electricity cost, for example. You have the revenue share that the LA would the local authority would be looking for. You have the CPO margin, which is required to recoup investment in growing and maintaining the network, and finally VAT. You know, and I would argue that actually even today, the local authority has a lot of control over most of those components except for VAT. So on electricity cost, you know, some local authorities can actually procure electricity at a much lower cost than a CPO could, which would give them greater control and certainty over the tariff charge to end users and the fluctuations in how you pass on the variable electricity cost. You know, we're very open, Urban Fox at least, to working with local authorities to find the most optimal energy procurement strategy to ensure residents get the best deal. The local authority revenue share is obviously something local authorities can control. So if closing the gap between private and public charging is important, we would obviously urge them to not place a huge emphasis on trying to achieve the greatest revenue share possible while still expecting the highest level of private sector investment at the lowest tariff possible, you know, because something has to give, and that will probably be in the quality of the network and service that they end up with. You know, the CPO margin is there really to recoup what is a considerably risky investment at this point in time and to eventually generate a return, you know, but it should be simple and transparent to help facilitate this tariff setting. You know, so for an Urban Fox's case, you know, we use a fixed pence per kilowatt hour margin that only increases with inflation over time. That can be very transparent. But as discussed earlier, you know, the CPO margin is linked to the contract length. So the longer the contract, the lower the CPO margin can be. So again, that is something that the local authorities can control today. And when it comes to VAT, you know, as I'm sure we're all probably aware, that is something that none of us control. There is a huge disparity between private and public charging. One's at 5%, one's at 20%. So I urge all of us to lobby central government to get that changed. You know, other areas to look at to close the gap are, you know, innovation in tariffs, whether using, you know, off-peak or agile, even using grid services, you know, to give users of a public network a rebate, you know, to help balance the grid at times of high demand. We would look to work with local authorities to generate alternative revenue streams, for example, to help subsidize the tariff. That could be through sponsors. Yeah, and also working with car sharing clubs to ensure that those on lower incomes can also take part in the EV revolution. You know, and the final point, well, actually, but keep in mind the cost of public charging is still cheaper now than having a petrol or diesel car. That's the other point that we should just keep in mind. But one other point I would like to make is the headline tariff that we compare between public and private charging is really comparing apples with pears. You know, the public charging tariff includes the cost, the capital cost to install and maintain that network, whereas often the headline private tariff doesn't. So I would just always ask, local authorities to really think about the true total cost to that end user when comparing the two tariffs. But there's so much we can do by working together, under a collaborative, partnership, and that's something that that we strive for. Sorry for the long answer, but there's so much to say on this, honestly, and I'm sure
it was a long question.
Other CPOs will say the same thing.
Thanks, Ollie. Okay, I'm going to go to the Q&A section now. There's quite a few questions, so if we could keep our answers nice and short and concise, that would be really great. So the first question is for Aaron. Knowing the numbers and the timescale, would it not work better to offer funding for the DC wall box units on top of the AC EV SEs? Work better to offer funding for the DC wall box units on top of the AC EV SEs?
I think so. The focus was that's around the workplace charging scheme, is it? It wasn't entirely clear. I mean, the focus for us in terms of where we offer grant funding is primarily in areas that need support. Right now, whether it's now generally that is more in the sort of slower charging on street space than the sort of rapid charging market. So we are being careful not to intervene in areas that are working well already or are starting to work well. And there was a question in the chat around sort of supporting private charge points with driveways, and that is an area where we've kickstarted the market. It's been successful, and therefore we are no longer supporting that. And as Ollie was pointing out, the sort of disparity between public and private charging, that does require those people with driveways to make that upfront investment, and that does need to be taken into account in the disparity.
Thank you. Next question is to all, but let's go to Jon first. Do you think the government delays are affecting public take-up of EVs? You're on mute, Jon.
I think any delay that delays installation of EV charging infrastructure must have an effect ultimately on the hesitancy that is out there. I'm not sure specifically what delay the question is referring to. I don't know whether it's referring to the dilution of the 100% to 80% in 2030. I don't think that will have a massive impact, but as I said earlier, it's about maintaining confidence from investors, and indeed for those people who are about to buy an EV, the infrastructure is going to be there for them.
Thank you. Vicky?
Same question to me. I think Ion's just made the right point, which is I think we spent a lot of time this morning very usefully looking at the very specific things we can do to accelerate this. There's also a slightly more amorphous thing which is sitting above all this, which is confidence. And that's confidence of investors, that's confidence of consumers. And of course, consumers are also people who make decisions, so decisions in landlords, local authorities, all of us who are involved in making this decision. So I think we've all got a job to do to try and reassure those people who are making decisions, who are thinking about moving to an EV or thinking about playing a role in supporting this. One of the things that was in the plan for drivers that Aaron mentioned right at the start, lots of useful things around removing barriers, but also there was a piece in there about misinformation and information for consumers. And I think that's not just a job for government, although I think we'd love government support. I think it's all of us need to work together to work out, how to reassure people that this is okay. It's actually fine. There are things that you need to know about, but that it's all going to be okay. And I think there's that general sense of unease perhaps has set in over the last 6 months, and the media has a role to play there. So we do need to find a way to collaborate together to provide that positive messaging.
Thank you, Vicky. I'm going to go to the next question for Aaron. An election is due in the next year or so, and there is every chance there will be a new party in charge afterwards. Changing the deadline to 2035 appears to have been a reaction to one by-election result. What do you think are the chances 2030 could be reinstated by a new government?
Okay, so I'm glad you asked that question, because I just wanted to come back on Ion's point. I mean, the target to 2030 is as it was. There has been no change there. So that there was always the case that the ZEV mandate was going to set out 80% of new vehicles would need to be fully electric or fully zero emission by 2030. So that hasn't changed. It's that what the change in the policy was between 2030 and 2035. Previously, there would have needed to have been, they would have needed to be hybrids. So still with a plug, but hybrids, and now 20%, which decreases over time, can be petrol and diesel vehicles. So it's no change to 2030. Just to re-emphasize that. To speculate on the next government, I think generally in this space, that all major parties are broadly aligned, in terms of net zero, in terms of the future being electric. I think there is a great deal of certainty, regardless of the political flavour of party. At the margins, for sure, there are differences between parties, and we've seen that over the course of the last few months. But I think the headlines in terms of the ZEV mandate are actually quite positive in this particular sector, and I think we should probably focus more on that than the change between 2030 and 2035, which is not hugely material in the scheme of things. I mean, the direction is very clear. It's not obvious it will change from a sort of a political perspective anytime soon.
Thank you. I'm going to take one more question from the Q&A. We'll try and get all the others answered after the webinar and sent out to everybody. So the last one, where does the panel see the role of subnational transport bodies? Who wants to take this question?
I'm happy to kick that off in the first instance. A number of people have talked about sort of collaboration and scale being really important in this space, and aligning strategies. We have been encouraging the STBs to help local authorities in collaborating on their strategies, on their procurements ultimately, and they certainly have a role in doing that. I mean, scale, as a number of the panelists have said, can support better procurements and ultimately lower charges, lower tariffs to consumers. So the more collaboration in this space, the better, and the Levi Fund has certainly been encouraging that.
Thank you. I don't think we have time for another question, so we might just have to wrap up here. But thank you to our panelists for their valuable insights, and all of you for being a part of what we hope was a thought-provoking discussion. We'll be sending copies of the slide decks out to everyone, so don't worry. If you'd like a copy of the heads of terms referred to by Ollie, please get in touch via our website, urbanfox.network. We hope you leave today with a clearer understanding of the road ahead and potential strategies to de-risk our journey towards sustainable EV charging infrastructure. As I said, the questions that weren't answered today, we'll try and get them answered by the panel and sent out to everybody who attended. But thank you for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you all. Thanks.
Thank
Thanks all.
you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.